This conference will now be recorded.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the SCLF webinars. This is webinar number 10, and I'm delighted that we have John Cleland back to give our presentation today. He's a real trooper doing a double dunter, so but I'll go on and properly introduce him in a wee minute. Just a few housekeeping things. This webinar today has been recorded for those that are just joining, and therefore if you don't want to be seen on camera, then make sure your camera is off. You will all be joining muted, and if you can just stay that way through John's presentation, that would be appreciated, and it just prevents lots of feedback during the presentation. In terms of questions, feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and you can find that up at the wee sort of speech bubble up on the right hand side of your screen. You can use that to say hello, say where you're coming from, and put in any questions for John. But when we have a Q&A at the end of the session, then feel free as well to unmute yourself at that time. And as I say, that bit won't be recorded, so we can have a discussion if you wish. We know about next week, so next Thursday, same time, we are due to have Will Farden from I2 Analytical, who's going to do a presentation based on laboratory analysis. So I'll be sending out details of that probably tomorrow to get that booked. If you have any ideas for future webinars, you can put them in the feedback form, which I'll be putting in the chat later on. Or if you want, you can just put it in the chat as you maybe think about some future things that you would like to hear as a webinar. Just pop that in the chat and I'll be reviewing that later. Maybe you want to present something like a case study or something, that would be quite good to see some case studies, might be of interest to folk. So I think that's all the introductions I need to do, other than to actually introduce John. So John is a principal environmental scientist at GDG Geosolutions, and he's got over 26 years experience in environmental practice with a focus on contaminated land and legacy management. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to John.
Thanks, Alison. Maybe I should turn off my video as well. Who wants to be looking at me? Okay, so I will admit that when I started looking at this presentation, I suddenly realized I'd bitten off far more than I could chew. But anyway, I'm going to be talking about soil management and how the soil testing strategies might impact that, and some of the key questions to ask in as simple a way as I possibly can. Now, quite often you'll have a look at a soil management plan and it might look something like this. This is essentially battleships, but it's less like battleships and more like 3D chess, in the sense that you're dealing with things in 3 dimensions. So just remember that whilst the presentation is relatively simplistic, always remember that when you're going to be doing your soil sampling and putting together your dig plans and soil management strategies, that you're dealing with things in 3 dimensions. Okay, so we're essentially, when you're talking about soil management, you're talking about cut and fill, you're talking about excavating basements or whatever. It's what you're going to do with that soil that you're excavating and moving around. That's what's in the scope of this presentation. Everything else isn't. So I'm not really going to be talking about whether or not something is classed as a waste or not. That's a philosophical question for many. So a soil that is going to be reused on site may not be classified as a waste, but then other people may classify it as such. So I'd rather not get into that very thorny subject. So I'm going to assume that as part of all the pre-works that you've done, you've established whether or not it's a waste or not, and whether or not you're doing cut and fill, and whether or not it's appropriate from a geotechnical perspective. Otherwise, I'll be here for far more hours presenting to you. So if there are any questions, by all means ask, but at this stage I'd rather avoid getting into some of the more thorny aspects. So for the purposes of this, I wanted to create a scenario, all right, because it's far easier to try and describe things on the basis of a scenario than just some kind of ethereal kind of project. So you've done your site investigation, or you have some site investigation data. You've also confirmed that there's uncontaminated subsoils and soils. There's a variety of impacted materials that can either be retained under hard standing, kept in open spaces, or needs to be treated or disposed off site because it's just too bad. That again may seem very simplistic, but more often than not, those are the kinds of categories of material that you're going to come across in a contaminated site. For this particular example, there is a net zero requirement. So basically, you don't need to get rid of any material, okay? Because there's upfill, there's cut, and it's all nicely balanced. So you want to limit the amount of material you're going to be disposing off site. Okay. So what do you need? What's your objective? So you're going to obviously clearly identify the nature and the extent of the material. So you've done your risk assessment. You understand the development requirements, i.e. there's going to be a basement over here, there's going to be foundations there's going to be piling. And so you've actually done all that work. You need to make sure that the information you have allows as much comfort in that assessment as possible. Now, you have to be speaking to the contractor, the client, and the regulator, because it's a balance of all those aspects that you have to get right to make sure that your soil management plan meets the expectations of those three stakeholders. You need to make sure that you're compliant from a soil management perspective, so you can't be putting material that is unsuitable for a landscaped area in that landscaped area. So you've got to make sure that your data gives you that kind of comfort. So data is critical, and it's king. So do you have enough data? Can it form, is the level of detail that you have, is it sufficiently, does it sufficiently cover your site to give you comfort? Oh God, what the hell happened there? Sorry, that's weird. Sorry about that. Sorry for the swearing there, apologies. Does the data, now that second one, does the data provide information across the depth of the excavation as well as laterally? So it's always nice, you see these lovely contour plots showing the distribution of contamination based on your site investigation. Looks great, but does it also provide you with that depth range as well? So you just need to make sure that you've got that covered, hence the reference to 3D chess earlier on. And if you don't have the lateral or the horizontal extent of data that you need for the works, is your client or the contractor happy to assume worst case? Because the regulator would certainly expect you to assume worst case if you don't have data across a depth range of an excavation. So there you go. If you don't have to remove something, then don't. We're not talking about remediation here. That's important. So that's a completely different thing to talk about. So we're only talking about soil management from an excavation, soil management, cut and fill perspective. As soon as you start talking about remediation, it becomes a very different conversation that we're going to have. So what are you going to do when you're looking at data that you may have collected, or indeed others have collected? And I've got an example of something which I had to do relatively recently, where I had to work with historic data. What you're trying to do is, if you're going to develop your site sampling plan, don't just base it on a hypothetical. What I mean by that is that if you're just going to go out and do a site investigation, say, right, we're going to do our window samples to 5 meters, we're going to collect samples every meter, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, that's all fine. However, if the maximum depth of your excavations are 10 meters, which can happen, then you've only got data from that first 5 meters. So what do you do about the next 5? So it's really important that you consider soil management when you're developing your site sampling strategy. You've also got to make sure that you've got the right coverage. So depending on the material that you're working in, if it's a homogeneous material, then you're going to need less samples per cube of material that you're going to excavate, because it's pretty much all the same. But if it's a very heterogeneous made ground that's quite variable, then you're going to have to adjust your sampling numbers accordingly. That last point there about the laydown for stockpiles is actually quite critical in that. So you've got your cut and fill balances, so you've already sorted that out. You've designed your site investigation according to excavations, depths, and lateral extent. You might have been dealing with historic data, so you want to pull together a supplementary testing regime to fill in those blanks. And the whole purpose of a laydown area for soils to be retested comes into play if the material is so varied. You might come across something which is far worse, or indeed far better, and you want to make sure that the contractor is managing soils appropriately. When it comes to devising your soil management strategy, it can become quite complicated if you don't have an allowance for stockpiling, and it can become quite costly as well, because you again are taking worst case. But once you've started excavating materials, you might end up excavating one block, and actually you've categorized it in one way because you've got one sample, and then suddenly you find it's a lot better a quality material. So actually you can benefit the contractor and the client by re-examining that material. There are specifications for sampling from stockpiles. Again, depending on the material, correct me if I'm wrong, it's usually around about one sample for about is it 10 cube? I'd have to double check that. I do apologize. But certainly just double check how many samples you need to collect, but the more data, the better. Okay. And sampling from stockpiles is different from sampling in situ. So you've established, you need to establish whether or not it's waste or whether or not it's suitable for reuse. But I'll ask a question of you. It's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer it. I just know how often I've seen it. when you're dealing with a contractor and you're talking about waste classification or waste acceptance criteria testing, the amount of times that I've seen a contractor present me with WAC tests to tell me whether or not a sample is suitable for reuse, or what waste classification is way too often. Make sure that when you develop your soil management strategy for a site, that you clearly identify the difference between the waste classification and waste acceptance. For a start, waste acceptance tests so WAC tests are quite expensive. Chris is on the line, he knows how much they are. So you want to try and limit the amount of WAC testing you've done, and it's just quite ironic in some respects that contractors are quite keen to save money, but they'll do a WAC test instead of just doing a standard chemical analysis suite for waste classification. It's the irony isn't lost on me, because we're often arguing over how many tests we want to get done. And anyway, let's move on from that one. So just make sure that when you're doing your evaluations, you're evaluating it on the right data. Okay. So I've got this. Now, this is from Ireland. This is Republic of Ireland. It isn't as simple as just saying, in Republic of Ireland anyway, whether or not something is hazardous or non-hazardous. So here you classify your soils based on you've done your haz waste online or equivalent, and you have determined whether or not it's a hazardous or non-hazardous, and your WAC test has determined what class of landfill it needs to go to. But in Republic of Ireland, and this is an example from IMS or IML, landfill in Dublin or near Dublin, where, oh no, what is wrong with this? My computer is possessed. I do apologize. When you come to, so in this circumstance, when it came to looking at creating a dig plan for a site in Dublin, the process became far more complicated than just saying, is it hazardous or is it non-hazardous material? We had to do, there was all these subcategories. There is a category A, by the way, but that's for completely clean, not made ground, pristine material. So it didn't come into this project in Dublin. So we had to effectively develop a dig plan using these criteria on top of that initial evaluation of whether it was hazardous or non-hazardous. So just what you're better off doing, make sure that you've spoken to the landfill prior to you finalizing your soil management strategy, because if it does have to go off site, you need to make sure that the contractor isn't suddenly going to come across, you might have initially classified it as a non-hazardous material, but all of these 4 classifications are all non-hazardous. But the difference between the cost of a category B1 and a category C2 is around about 100, in this case, about 100 euros a ton. So you can imagine if your client has costed all based on a non-hazardous B1 type material, suddenly to be told, well, actually, no, this is a category C2, they're not going to be particularly happy. So just make sure that you've classified the material properly when you develop your nice pretty pictures for the contractor. So let's look at an example site. Okay. Oh no, I've got no idea, Alison, why this is happening, so I do apologize. Let's look at this example site. We have a building that's going to be built. That's the red dotted line. We have a 3 meter deep excavation. We've got roadways, we've got turning circles, we've got landscaped areas. Just assume the rest is just going to be hard standing and nothing particularly interesting to talk about there. But the one thing this plan doesn't talk about is whether or not there's service runs, what types of foundations. Is it going to be piling? Are the piles going to be driven or augured? The generation of spoil material is obviously going to be different for both of those piling options. Each of those crosses represents where you've collected samples. Are you happy? Is the client happy to use those sample locations and the sampling density to categorize the material that's going to be moved around on site? Because it does have a significant impact on cost and time in particular. So what, just to try and illustrate the point, we've got 4 categories of soil here. You've got your uncontaminated, you've got your impacted soils that can be used in hard landscaping, you've got impacted soils that are okay in open spaces, and you've got category 4 material that just has to be treated or disposed off site. In the case of this particular site, disposal is an option which they'd rather avoid. So at the moment, your distribution of sampling points doesn't necessarily allow you to focus that in to limit that. You've got to take a worst case in terms of establishing the extent of that category 4 material. The rest is probably not going to be that big a problem from a development point of view, because there's always opportunity to put that material somewhere on site where it's suitable for use. So if we look at E2, this one here, it may be unacceptable between 0 and 1 meter, but H1 here, which is the same category, is okay between 0 and 1 meter, but it's actually at 2 meters at the problem. So this is why I'm saying you need to make sure that your data is aligned vertically as well as laterally. Okay. I think I said horizontal instead of vertically earlier, so do apologize again for that. So keeping it simple, you've then got to work with, well, you've created, quite often you will have done a contour plot of your contamination. Okay, so it might look something like that. I know this is a bit rough and ready, but your contour plot may look something like that, where you've got the bit in the middle where you're estimating this is your the material that is just not suitable for retention on site. For the sake of this example, I'm just assuming that across the depth of your excavation, you've got data that is showing that this entire blob is a problem. Okay. Are you happy to extend this line all the way out there and say, well, actually, all that material is a problem? Now, from a risk point of view, actually, can you see my pointer? I don't know, maybe not. Sorry, I do apologize. I think that you can't see my.
No, we can, John.
Can't, yeah, sorry.
No, we can.
You can. Oh, right. Okay.
Yes.
Anyway, so you have this estimated contour plot showing the extent of your problem material. If you were to just accept that, then that's fine. I mean, from a risk point of view, you might be being very conservative, and the client might be happy with that. There might be a reason for that, time, for example. But otherwise, do you look to ask for additional data to minimize this, or at least to confirm that actually what you're going to be excavating as a disposed of material or treated material is right? You might say, well, actually, I want to make sure that this line here extends all the way over to here. You know, does it actually, if we were to do sampling in here, does it actually find that there's a indication that actually this material here is the same as this? So you're cutting off quite a large proportion of your heavily impacted material. So don't be afraid to ask for that and rationalize it on the basis that in doing some delineation sampling in an area of concern makes sense. Okay, and just do that. Okay, right. Oh, I seem to have, right. Okay, so a contractor deals with generally straight lines. Okay, they don't like curvy lines when it comes to them getting their diggers out on site. So you've then, and this is actually one of the other reasons why you want to do delineation sampling, because obviously when you start putting straight lines on things around a contour, you're going to be over excavating based on that contour. Okay, so the more delineation you can do, the more constrained these lines are going to be. Okay, so you're going to be able to reduce that problem. Now, I will stress that a lot of the work you do to establish those areas for excavation is I don't like saying best guess, but it is a best guess more often than not. You're trying to anticipate the extent of contaminated material on your site. So always include a watching brief in your construction environmental management plan and your soil management plan, so that you can make allowances for unexpected material. You will likely have a contamination discovery plan as part of your SMP, and that basically says, well, you know, these are the types of contaminants that we've found on site. This is how they look. Make sure that when you're doing your work on site, that if you do come across this, you know what to do with it. Okay, and that is, make sure that the contractor knows exactly what protocols to follow, what samples to collect, what to get them analysed for, and what to assess them against. They don't always have third-party specialists on site. It's ideal, but they don't always do that. So try and make sure that your soil management plan includes all that. Okay, you also, if you are going to be on site doing it, it's useful having that in there, because then they can't question why you're doing something. Okay, I just wanted to talk about piling briefly. If you're going to be piling to 20 meters, it's possible that you don't actually have data for that entire length of the pile. Landfills, so if that material is going to be taken off site, then landfills will expect you to properly classify that material. Now, because of the nature of the piling process, so let's say you're augering it, the piling process will add potentially contaminating materials. Generally, they'll increase the pH more often than not, because you're adding cement or whatever. You need to be able to show the landfill that that material they're going to accept is indeed acceptable. The example in the next slide from Dublin had exactly that problem. So when I talked about having a stockpiling area, quite often that would be used for your pilerizing, so that you can actually subsample them to confirm suitability for reuse, for example, but also for disposal. It's not just the pile itself, you've also got the pile cap too, and you just want to make sure that you've got that covered when it comes to classification. Okay. Let's see. Yes, so that there, stockpiling area. Try and convince your client to try and include a stockpiling area. It's quite useful if you come across unexpected contaminated material as well. So it gives you that peace of mind that you can get it sampled and tested to get it managed properly. Okay. Oh no. That again. Jeez. Sorry about this. I don't know why that's happening. So this is an example from a site in Dublin where I was presented with numerous different historical site investigation information, and it was painful, I will say that, because the depths primarily of the samples, the total depths of the excavations and boreholes weren't to the maximum extent of the excavations that were for the development. And there was an expectation to be able to classify the soils that were going to be excavated to a sufficient degree to allow it to be disposed off site, but also to minimize the unnecessary disposal of particularly category D, the hazardous material, because that was getting sent off to the Netherlands because there are no hazardous material landfills in the Republic. So we had to try and limit that. Now, the data that we had originally, so ignoring what you see there at the moment, just imagine that this site was covered in squares that size. Now that is an area of 200 square meters. Okay, so each of those blocks. Okay, so you can imagine that site just split into 200 square meter blocks, and the dig depth was going to be around about 10 to 20 meters, and there was also going to be piling, which didn't get told to us until much later in the day. But anyway, so you can imagine that that's a lot of material that they're talking about. And when you're looking at a depth range of samples that don't quite cover the maximum depth of the excavations, and you're not allowed to do significant supplementary testing, you have to make some fairly large assumptions about the quality. So we had to work very closely with the landfill site to make sure that we categorize the material according to their requirements, because what we didn't want was material being sent to them and them saying, we are not accepting this because we're not happy with the data. So as you can see, what we ended up with was a mechanism of supplementing some of that data, particularly in this middle area, because this category C1 in here, all right, originally this extended all the way across that entire block. Okay, what we were able to do with the supplementary test was narrow down the category C1 and actually confirm that the majority of that material was a category B1. Now, when I was talking to you about the cost difference of about 100 euros per ton, you can see that by doing that, there's a significant saving to the contractor and client on that. Now, furthermore, when it came to the category D1, that originally extended all the way across to here, all the way across here Oh no. So we were able to try and at least limit that to an extent that was practical. And the landfill eventually, working with us, like I say, were happy with this plan. Now, this is just one level. This is the 0 to 1 meter excavation, and we had a number of different depth ranges at each meter strip that we presented to the contract, that we presented the landfill, so that they were happy that when they got a truck arriving that was from this zone here, they knew that it was a category B1, and they ticked off on that. And that was pretty positive. So when you're going to be developing your plan, this may be how it looks. Okay. I will say that our problem with this was that the investigations were not designed for the development in specific. So the depth range of samples weren't ideal. When it came to piling, the maximum depth of piles was about 20 meters. There was no data for that. We had to reach an agreement with the landfill to allow for appropriate sampling of materials in the areas of each pile to confirm the suitability for sending it to their site. They had had some issues with pile arisings being high pH, and they were worried that it would be a problem for them. Okay, so just make sure you've got plenty of data. To summarize that, make sure that you're thinking of things in 3 dimensions. Okay, if you're going to be designing an investigation from scratch, try and do so with that endpoint in mind. If you're doing a geoenvironmental investigation, you may want to consider speaking to the contractor to make sure you understand what their process is going to be, so that you can actually develop an appreciation of the types of material in line with the work that's going to be done, rather than it just being some fairly generic assessment. Okay, so if you're going to be maximum excavation 3 meter and you've only got soil test 2 meters, then obviously that is not going to necessarily be adequate, particularly if it's a heterogeneous material. So just make sure that you've got sufficient data. If you're doing 1 meter strips, for example, composite sampling across a 3 meter trial pit won't necessarily give you a good indication, and the landfill may not be particularly happy with that. So don't be scared again to ask the client or say to the client, no, we need that extra information. That's why we're doing an extra sample per location in this area, because don't be scared to ask for that. Ultimately, it will save the client a lot of headaches in the future. Like I said, talk to the contractor if you can, or at least speak to the client about the assumptions that you're making on strip depths and lengths, because the client may not have gone to a contractor, so it's again, more often not your pre-contract selection. So just make sure that you're making the right assumptions. Strip depths are usually, or excavation, as you go down, usually around about the meter mark. So just try and, again, keep it simple, keep it to those meter depths, and just make sure that's clearly identified in your dig plan, your soil management plan. Otherwise, forget it. Now, after you've done your investigation, again, pre-contractor selection, you may not be able to do a dig program, but you may want to give an indication. Okay. Now, a contamination discovery plan is, for a contaminated site, is probably going to be fairly critical. They're getting asked for on a fairly regular basis by regulators. It can be fairly simple, but my recommendation to you is to make sure that the discovery plan includes clear protocols, okay, for sampling densities, particularly, and the schedule for testing. Another project that we're involved in at the moment, where sadly the route for the EPC contract is quite complicated. So we're not directly involved in managing the environmental aspects of the work. When you get to a point where the contractor is trying to organize sampling and testing during works, yet they've got no protocols, it can make for a very awkward conversation with the client. So I would say that make sure that you, at an early point, if you're asked to do a soil management plan, be very, very clear about how many samples you need. Oh no. Sorry again. Why is it doing this? Where was I? Just make sure that you have those clear protocols in place for the client. It'll save you a lot of headaches in the future if you do that. Again, as part of that contamination discovery plan and soil management plan, you may need validation protocols as well. So if you're excavating material and you're stockpiling it, you just need to make sure that you've got if you've got screening criteria for your site, for example, just make sure that that's clearly identified, so that it's easy for you to explain to a contractor why material A can't be used in the landscape area. I know it seems very simplistic, but actually soil management doesn't have to be a complicated issue. So my recommendation is to keep it simple, and that's it. I know that this has been seems like a very rushed presentation, and I do apologize, but I think that I've wanted to cover a fairly broad topic, and there may be some questions. I'm hoping there are, so please ask away.
Thank you very much, John. That was great. I'm just going to stop the recording now for the questions.